The holographic display hummed with a soft, almost menacing energy. Zarak adjusted her research lenses, the multiple crystalline apertures shifting to capture every minute detail of the redacted historical document. Rows of data points flickered and danced, most obscured by dense black censorship markers that seemed to pulse with an intelligence of their own. Around her, the University of Galactic Histories stretched out in its massive, spiraling architecture. Pillars of translucent data crystals rose like frozen waves, each containing millennia of carefully curated knowledge. But this particular database about humans, stood out as an anomaly that made even the most seasoned researchers uncomfortable. Impossible, Zarak muttered, her primary language translator converting the soft click of her speech into standard galactic communication. Her research supervisor, Professor Kathax, had warned her against pursuing this line of investigation. Some archives, he'd said, are sealed for reasons beyond academic curiosity. But Zarak was not one to be deterred by institutional warnings. As a junior researcher specializing in emerging species development, she had built her entire academic reputation on challenging established narratives. Her previous work on adaptive civilization models had already raised eyebrows across multiple academic departments. The display flickered again. For a microsecond, a fragment of text became visible, something about psychological adaptive capacity and nonlinear threat assessment. Then it vanished, replaced by another wall of redacted information. Her research terminal, a sophisticated quantum-linked device that could typically parse even the most complex encrypted data, seemed to struggle. Multiple computational pathways lit up and then went dark, as if the very information was resisting analysis. Most researchers would have given up, but Zarak saw this as a challenge. She activated her secondary research protocols. Thin tendrils of bioluminescent data probes extended from her research interface, attempting to find microscopic gaps in the encryption. Each probe was a sophisticated blend of quantum computing and biological intelligence, designed to navigate information landscapes that traditional systems couldn't penetrate. The first probe dissolved almost instantly. The second lasted slightly longer, capturing a fragmented image before being erased. It was enough. A momentary capture showed what appeared to be a human settlement, but not like any settlement in the current galactic records. The architecture was simultaneously primitive and complex, with structures that seemed to grow and adapt rather than being constructed. "Fascinating," she whispered. Her communication implant chirped. An incoming message from Talaran, her data analysis colleague. "Are you still pursuing the human archives? The Administrative Council is sending warning signals." Zarak knew the risks. Unauthorized deep research into sealed archives could result in academic suspension, or worse. The Galactic Historical Commission was notoriously protective of certain information, and humans seemed to be their most guarded topic. She recalled her initial fascination with humans. During her xenoanthropology studies, brief mentions of the species had always been accompanied by a strange mix of respect and unease. Presentations about human history were always carefully curated, with massive gaps that no one seemed willing to explain. Another data probe penetrated deeper. This time, it captured a fragment of text that made Zarak's respiratory chambers constrict with excitement. When humans entered the galactic stage, traditional threat assessment models became obsolete. Their capacity for adaptive innovation transcends. The text vanished, replaced by another wall of redaction. But it was enough. Zarak had discovered something significant. Humans were not just another species in the vast galactic ecosystem. They were something else entirely, a variable that existing scientific models couldn't comprehend. Her research had just taken a turn that would change everything. And she knew, with a certainty that burned through her entire being, that she would uncover the truth about why humans were forbidden from galactic conflicts, no matter the cost. The holographic display continued to flicker, keeping its secrets for now. But Zarak was patient and persistent. The university's research complex hummed with quiet anticipation. Zarak had assembled her team in the most secure research chamber available, a space typically reserved for classified sino-historical investigations. Talleyrand arrived first, his crystalline body refracting the soft ambient light into 1,000 tiny rainbows. "I hope you understand the risk," Talleyrand said, his computational nodes flickering with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. As a Viren data analyst, he was trained to calculate probabilities with near-perfect accuracy. And right now, the probability of their research being shut down was astronomically high. Luma entered next, her empathetic luminescence casting a soft, almost ethereal glow around the room. Where Talleyrand was pure logic, Luma represented emotional intelligence in its most refined form. She could read the subtlest nuances of communication, detecting meanings hidden between words and data points. The final member of their team arrived with characteristic skepticism. Enks, the computational expert, seemed to phase into the room rather than walk. Their quantum-linked consciousness was always partially elsewhere, processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. "We've been summoned for a reason," Zorak began, projecting the fragmented data she had uncovered. The holographic display flickered with partial images and redacted text, creating a mosaic of mystery. Talleyrand's computational systems went into overdrive. Thin tendrils of data-gathering probes extended from his form, analyzing every pixel of information. "These redaction patterns are unusual," he observed. "It's not standard classification protocol. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to hide something." Luma moved closer to the display, her empathetic sensors picking up emotional residues embedded in the data. "There's a sense of fear," she said softly. "Not just institutional caution. Genuine, primal fear." Enks remained silent, their quantum processors running complex analysis algorithms that would take standard computational systems millennia to complete. "Humans," Zorak said, turning to face her team. "We need to understand why an entire species has been systematically erased from standard galactic historical records." The room's security systems hummed slightly louder, a warning that their investigation was being monitored, but they had gone too far to turn back now. Talleyrand began reconstructing the fragmented data. Piece by piece, a narrative started to emerge. Fragments of human history that didn't align with any known evolutionary or technological development models. Sporadic mentions of conflicts that defied traditional strategic understanding. "Look at this," Enks spoke for the first time, projecting a series of complex computational models. "Their technological progression doesn't follow any standard pattern. It's more like a quantum leap than a linear progression." Luma's empathetic sensors picked up something else. Embedded in the data were emotional signatures that didn't make sense. Resilience that bordered on impossible. Adaptability that seemed to rewrite the very rules of species development. "They're not just a species," Luma whispered. "They're a phenomenon." As if in response, the research chamber's security systems began to activate. Subtle warning signals suggested their investigation had triggered some kind of automated response. Zorak knew they were close to something significant. The very act of gathering this information seemed to be awakening something, a protective mechanism far more complex than simple data classification. Talleyrand's computational systems began to overheat. "We're missing something," he said, his usually calm voice tinged with an emotion remarkably close to excitement. "Something fundamental about their nature." Enks projected a series of potential scenarios, each one more incredible than the last. Humans as adaptive organisms, humans as technological wildcard, humans as a species that didn't just interact with their environment, but fundamentally transformed it. Outside the research chamber, the university's administrative systems were beginning to take notice. Alerts were being generated. Protocols were being activated. But inside the chamber, 4 researchers had crossed a line. They were no longer just investigating a mystery. They were unraveling a secret that could change everything about how galactic civilizations understood themselves. And they were just getting started. The communication relay hummed with an encrypted frequency that most standard galactic networks would dismiss as background noise. Zorak's specialized quantum comm device, a prototype developed in the university's most advanced research labs, caught the signal with precision. "We have a response," she announced to her team, her voice barely above a whisper. The message came from an unexpected source, a human diplomatic outpost on the distant colony world of New Horizon. The location was deliberately obscure, a remote settlement that existed on the fringes of galactic chartered space. Most diplomatic channels would have ignored such a transmission, but their research had been carefully crafted to attract exactly this kind of attention. Luma leaned forward, her empathetic sensors scanning the incoming transmission. "The communication carries emotional markers," she observed. "Deliberate, calculated, but with an underlying current of something else." As quantum processors began decoding the message, layers of encryption falling away like delicate petals. Talvarin's computational systems ran parallel verification protocols, ensuring every fragment of data was authentic. The message was deceptively simple. "Interesting approach. Not many researchers dig this deep. Suggest secure communication channel. Encrypted quantum phase frequency attached." Zarak felt a surge of anticipation. This was not a standard diplomatic response. It was an invitation and a challenge. Establishing the secure communication took 3 standard galactic hours. Each verification protocol was a complex dance of quantum encryption, biosignature authentication, and multidimensional verification processes that would make standard communication networks seem primitive by comparison. When the connection stabilized, the holographic display revealed a human unlike any diplomatic representative they had expected. Marcus Rodriguez appeared to be in his late 60s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold entire universes of unspoken stories. His uniform was non-standard, a blend of diplomatic insignia and something that looked more like a research exploration outfit. "You're asking about the restriction," he said. It wasn't a question. Zarak's team exchanged glances. Their carefully prepared list of questions suddenly seemed inadequate. "We're trying to understand why humans are forbidden from participating in galactic conflicts," Talvarin responded, his computational language processors selecting the most precise linguistic configuration. Marcus Rodriguez laughed. It was a sound that didn't match any standard emotional response in their communication databases. Complex, multilayered, containing notes of humor, sadness, and something else entirely. "Forbidden?" he repeated. "That's not precisely accurate. It's more of a mutual agreement." Over the next several communication cycles, Rodriguez revealed fragments of a story that defied their existing understanding. Humans hadn't been banned from galactic conflicts. They had chosen to step back, a decision made after an incident so profound that it had fundamentally altered the galactic power structure. "Imagine a species," Rodriguez said, "that doesn't just fight wars. A species that transforms the entire concept of conflict." NX's quantum processors worked overtime, capturing every nuance of the communication. Luma's empathetic sensors detected layers of meaning beyond the spoken words. The diplomatic outpost where Rodriguez was stationed seemed to exist in a strange liminal space, not quite part of the galactic diplomatic network, but not entirely separate either. A buffer zone of information and possibility. "We discovered something about ourselves," Rodriguez continued, "something that made continuing traditional conflict unnecessary." Zarak pressed further. "What discovery?" For a moment, the holographic display flickered. Marcus Rodriguez's expression changed, a microsecond of something that might have been pride, might have been pain. "The ability to solve problems," he said finally. "Not just solve them. Fundamentally reimagine them." The transmission began to destabilize. Quantum encryption protocols were breaking down, but they had received something far more valuable than a simple explanation. They had received an invitation, a hint, a glimpse into a mystery that was far larger than they had initially imagined. As the holographic display went dark, Zarak realized their investigation had just entered an entirely new phase. The xenopsychology archives of the Galactic University were not a place most researchers dared to explore deeply. Sealed behind layers of quantum-encrypted barriers, the archives contained the most sensitive psychological profiles of known species. Zarak and her team had spent weeks gaining the necessary clearances, each authorization more complex than the last. Luma's empathetic sensors were working overtime. The moment they entered the archives, the ambient emotional residue became overwhelming. Layers of psychological data pressed against her consciousness like invisible waves, each spectrum of emotion telling a story far more complex than simple data points. These are not standard psychological profiles, Enks observed, quantum processors analyzing the data streams with inhuman precision. Thin tendrils of computational energy extended from their form, parsing information at speeds that would overwhelm most biological processing systems. Talrin's crystalline body refracted the soft archival lighting, his computational nodes creating intricate patterns of analysis. The human psychological profile is fundamentally different, he said, his voice a precise blend of scientific observation and something closer to wonder. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. A series of psychological adaptation studies that seemed to defy every known model of species development. Where most galactic species had predictable response patterns to environmental and social challenges, humans showed something entirely different. Adaptability was too simple a word. What the archives revealed was a species that didn't just adapt, they transformed. Not gradually, not through generations, but sometimes within a single lifetime. Their psychological infrastructure seemed to be less a fixed system and more of a dynamic, ever-changing network. Zarak pulled up a holographic representation of a human psychological profile. It was nothing like the neat categorized models of other species. Instead, it looked like a complex, three-dimensional web of interconnected possibilities. Nodes of potential shifted and realigned in real time, creating patterns that seemed to predict and then reshape potential futures. "Look at this," she called to her team, projecting the holographic model. Luma moved closer, her empathetic sensors trying to parse the emotional complexity. "It's like their psychological structure is a living system," she whispered. "Not fixed, not determined, but constantly negotiating with itself and its environment." Enkex's quantum processors began running complex simulation models based on the psychological data. Each simulation produced results that seemed to break fundamental rules of predictive psychology. Humans didn't just respond to challenges, they seemed to fundamentally redefine the nature of the challenge itself. Talrin's computational analysis revealed something even more extraordinary. In most species, psychological trauma created fixed response patterns, defensive mechanisms, limitations, but in human psychological profiles, trauma appeared to be transformed into something else entirely, a source of unexpected strength and innovation. "They don't just survive," Talrin said, his usually clinical voice holding a note of something close to respect. "They evolve through challenge." The archives contained case studies that defied comprehension. Humans who had experienced catastrophic loss, only to create entirely new systems of support and innovation. Communities that rebuilt not just physically, but psychologically, turning destruction into an opportunity for unprecedented growth. Zarak felt something she couldn't quite define. Excitement, fear, respect. The human psychological profile was less a static document and more of a living, breathing system of potential. "This is why they're restricted from galactic conflicts," she said softly. The rest of her team turned to listen. "They're not just another species," Zarak continued. "They're a fundamental reimagining of what a species can be." The archival systems seemed to pulse around them, as if the very information was alive, watching, waiting. Enkex's quantum processors completed their final simulation. The result was both beautiful and terrifying in its complexity. A species that didn't just interact with its environment, but continuously negotiated its own existence. Outside the archives, the university continued its daily rhythms. But inside this sealed chamber, 4 researchers were discovering something that would challenge everything about how galactic civilizations understood themselves. Humans were not just a species. They were a process of continuous, unimaginable potential. The holographic restoration chamber was a marvel of quantum-level technology. Designed to reconstruct fragmented historical records, it represented the pinnacle of archival reconstruction. Zorak and her team watched with collective breath held as the classified recording began to take shape. NKX's quantum processors worked in overdrive, each fragment of data carefully aligned and reconstructed. Talrin's computational systems ran simultaneous verification protocols. Luma's empathetic sensors picked up residual emotional signatures embedded within the deteriorating recording. At first, the image was little more than scattered light and distorted sound. Then, slowly, a narrative began to emerge. It was a battle record, but unlike any galactic conflict documentation they had ever encountered. The scene showed a small human fleet, by galactic standards, almost laughably insignificant. Sleek vessels that looked cobbled together, a mixture of advanced technology and what appeared to be improvised modifications. Against them, a massive armada of the Krellshar Imperium, a species renowned for their technological superiority and overwhelming military might. Impossible, Talrin muttered, his computational systems struggling to process the incoming data. The battle unfolded in a way that defied every known strategic model. The human fleet didn't just defend. They didn't just fight. They seemed to be engaging in a form of conflict that was more like a complex, three-dimensional dance. Smaller human vessels moved with a coordination that suggested something beyond standard tactical programming. They weren't just following predetermined strategies. They were improvising, adapting. Each ship moving as part of a living, breathing system. The Krellshar vessels, with their massive energy weapons and predictive targeting systems, found themselves outmaneuvered in ways that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of spatial combat. They're not just fighting, Luma observed, her empathetic sensors parsing the emotional residue of the battle. They're communicating, constantly, with each other, with their ships. Enks projected a computational model of the battle. The human fleet's movement patterns were unlike anything in the standard galactic combat archives. It was less a military engagement and more like a collaborative problem-solving exercise. One particular sequence caught Zorak's attention, a moment when the human fleet was clearly outgunned. Conventional tactical analysis would suggest total destruction was imminent. Instead, the humans did something extraordinary. They began to reconfigure their ships mid-battle. Not through external commands, but through what appeared to be a form of collective intelligence. Damaged vessels merged capabilities. Weapon systems were improvised from spare parts. Communication channels became adaptive neural networks. The Krellshar Imperium fleet, with all its technological superiority, found itself fighting an enemy that refused to follow any known rules of engagement. This is why, Zorak whispered, this is why they're restricted from galactic conflicts. The battle's conclusion was almost anticlimactic. The human fleet didn't destroy the Krellshar armada. They neutralized it, disabled its capabilities, turned a potential total war into a form of conflict resolution that was more like a complex negotiation. Talrin's computational systems were working at maximum capacity. The probability of this sequence of events, he said, is mathematically impossible. NKX's quantum processors displayed a series of potential scenarios, each one more incredible than the last. The human fleet had not just won a battle. They had fundamentally altered the nature of conflict itself. As the holographic recording began to dissolve, a final fragment became visible, a communication between human fleet commanders, not a military transmission. Something more. Problem solved, one said simply. The recording ended. Silence filled the restoration chamber. Zorak realized they had uncovered something far more significant than a historical record. They had found a glimpse into a fundamentally different way of understanding conflict, strategy, and collective intelligence. Humans were not just another species in the galactic ecosystem. They were something else entirely. The research team's analysis chamber transformed into a complex mapping system. Holographic projections of human strategic models filled the air, creating a three-dimensional landscape of possibility that defied traditional understanding. "It's not about winning," Zorak said, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of computational systems. "It's about solving." As quantum processors began to overlay the battle recordings with broader historical contexts, what emerged was not a history of conflict, but a history of systematic problem resolution. Each potential conflict became an opportunity for innovative solution finding. Talrand's computational systems displayed a series of comparative analyses, where other galactic species saw conflict as a binary proposition, victory or defeat. Humans approached challenges as complex, multidimensional problems to be understood and transformed. Luma moved through the holographic projections, her empathetic sensors picking up layers of emotional and strategic nuance. "They don't fight to destroy," she observed. "They engage to understand, to resolve, to create something new." The projections revealed a startling pattern. Human interventions in historical conflicts were never about territorial expansion or resource acquisition. They were about systemic transformation. Each engagement became an opportunity to reimagine existing structures, to find solutions that benefited multiple parties. One holographic reconstruction showed a diplomatic resolution that had previously been classified as a military intervention. What appeared to be a potential large-scale conflict was resolved through a series of collaborative problem-solving sessions. The human team didn't negotiate. They facilitated. They created new frameworks of understanding. "Look at the communication patterns," Enix said, projecting a complex web of interaction. Traditional diplomatic channels were linear, hierarchical. Human communication was more like a living ecosystem, adaptive, responsive, constantly reconfiguring. Talrand's analysis revealed something even more profound. Humans didn't just solve immediate problems. They anticipated and prepared for potential future challenges in ways that fundamentally altered existing systems. A series of historical case studies emerged. Conflicts that should have escalated were instead transformed into opportunities for collective growth. Resources that would have been used for destruction were redirected into collaborative development. "They're not peacekeepers," Zorak realized. "They're system architects." The research team watched as holographic projections showed humans entering complex social, technological, and environmental challenges. Each intervention was less about imposing a solution and more about creating conditions for collaborative problem-solving. Luma's empathetic sensors detected something extraordinary, an underlying emotional intelligence that transformed conflict from a destructive process into a creative one. Humans didn't seek to eliminate differences. They sought to understand them, to find value in complexity. Enix's quantum processors completed a comprehensive analysis. The probability models were unlike anything in galactic historical records. Where other species saw challenges as threats, humans saw them as opportunities for collective innovation. "This is why they're restricted," Talrand said, his computational voice holding a note of something close to respect. "They don't just change conflicts. They change the entire concept of conflict." The projections continued to shift. Each historical reconstruction revealed a species that refused to be limited by existing paradigms. Technological challenges became opportunities for collaborative innovation. Social conflicts became platforms for deeper understanding. Zorak felt something beyond scientific curiosity. A sense of profound respect was emerging. Humans weren't just another species in the galactic ecosystem. They were a fundamental reimagining of what collective intelligence could be. The research chamber seemed to pulse with the implications of their discovery. Humans had found a way to transform conflict itself, not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through a radical approach to collective problem-solving. As the holographic projections began to fade, one thing became crystal clear. The restriction on human participation in galactic conflicts was not a punishment. It was a form of protection. Protection for existing galactic systems that were not ready to be fundamentally reimagined. Enix's final computational model hung in the air. The complex, beautiful representation of human potential, not as a species of warriors or diplomats, but as architects of possibility. The university's ethical review chamber was unlike any other space in the research complex, designed to be a neutral ground for the most challenging intellectual and moral investigations. It seemed to absorb the weight of their discovery. Zarak stood before the Galactic Research Council, her team assembled behind her. The holographic displays surrounding them contained fragments of their research, each piece a potential challenge to everything the Council understood about interspecies dynamics. "We cannot simply suppress this information," Zarak began, her voice steady and clear. The Council members, representatives from 12 different galactic civilizations, shifted uncomfortably. Their collective body language spoke volumes. Fear, uncertainty, a deep-seated reluctance to confront a truth that could fundamentally alter existing power structures. Luma's empathetic sensors were working overtime. The emotional landscape of the chamber was a complex tapestry of conflicting responses. Fear mingled with curiosity. Defensiveness battled with an underlying sense of wonder. Talrin projected their research findings. Computational models danced through the air, revealing the intricate ways humans approached complex challenges. Each visualization was a challenge to conventional understanding. The restriction on human participation in galactic conflicts is not a punishment, Enck stated, quantum processors presenting a series of probabilistic scenarios. It is a form of collective protection. The Council's senior representative, a veteran diplomat from the Krell-Shar Imperium, leaned forward. Protection for whom? The question hung in the air, laden with unspoken implications. Zarak understood the deeper meaning. The research they had conducted threatened more than just historical understanding. It challenged the fundamental frameworks of galactic civilization. Humans were not just another species to be categorized and controlled. They were a potential catalyst for systemic transformation. Luma stepped forward, her empathetic presence filling the chamber. "Imagine a species," she said, "that doesn't see differences as threats. A species that transforms conflict into collaborative opportunity." The holographic displays shifted. Historical records of human interventions played out, each one a complex narrative of problem-solving that defied traditional diplomatic and military models. The Council members watched in uncomfortable silence. "We're not just talking about a species," Talrin's computational voice cut through the tension. "We're discussing a fundamental reimagining of collective intelligence." Each Council member represented a civilization with deeply entrenched conflict resolution models. Hierarchical, competitive, defined by clear boundaries and established power dynamics. Humans challenged every single one of those models. Enck's quantum processors began to project potential future scenarios. Each model showed how human approaches could transform existing galactic systems, not through conquest, not through domination, but through a radical approach to collaborative problem-solving. The ethical dilemma was clear. Releasing this information would challenge everything. The current galactic order was built on carefully maintained power balances, predictable interactions, controlled conflicts. Humans represented an unknown variable, a potential systemic shift that no existing model could fully comprehend. "We have a responsibility," Zarak said, her voice cutting through the tension. "To understand, to share knowledge." The Council chamber seemed to hold its collective breath. Luma's empathetic sensors detected something extraordinary. Beyond the fear and uncertainty, there was something else. A subtle current of hope, of possibility. The research they had conducted was more than an academic exercise. It was a potential key to reimagining galactic civilization itself. Talrin's final computational model hung in the air, a complex, beautiful representation of potential, not as a threat, but as an invitation to a different way of understanding collective existence. The senior council representative spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of generations of established thinking. "Some discoveries," he said, "are too dangerous to be fully understood." Zarak met his gaze. In that moment, she understood the true nature of their discovery. Humans were not just a species to be studied. They were a profound possibility waiting to be unleashed. The final presentation was scheduled in the most secure research chamber of the Galactic University. Zarak and her team had spent weeks preparing, knowing that this moment would change everything. Holographic displays shimmered to life, each projection a carefully constructed narrative of their discoveries about humanity. The chamber itself seemed to hold its breath, anticipation crackling through the air like electrical energy. Talryn's computational systems had prepared a presentation that defied traditional academic formats. Not a linear argument, but a dynamic, evolving exploration of human potential. Enx's quantum processors worked in synchronization, creating visualizations that seemed to breathe with living complexity. Luma stood beside Zarak, her empathetic sensors detecting the subtle emotional undercurrents of the gathered researchers, diplomats, and academic leaders. "Humans are not what we thought," Zarak began, her voice clear and resolute. "They are not a species to be categorized. They are a process of continuous possibility." The first holographic display showed the psychological profiles they had uncovered. Not static models, but dynamic webs of potential. Each node of information shifted and realigned, demonstrating an adaptive intelligence that seemed to defy fundamental understanding. Talryn projected the battle recordings, not as a demonstration of military might, but as a complex problem-solving exercise. The human fleet moved like a living organism, each vessel communicating, adapting, transforming the very nature of conflict. "They don't fight to win," Enx explained, quantum processors translating complex computational models into comprehensible language. "They engage to understand, to create new possibilities." The chamber grew silent. Luma's presentation revealed the emotional landscape of human interactions. Where other species saw boundaries, humans saw opportunities for connection. Where conflict would typically emerge, they found collaborative solutions. Fragment after fragment of evidence built a compelling narrative. Humans were not restricted from galactic conflicts because they were dangerous. They were restricted because they fundamentally challenged the existing paradigms of interaction. "We are presenting more than research," Zarak continued. "We are presenting a fundamental reimagining of collective intelligence." The final holographic display was their most daring contribution. The living model of human potential, not as a fixed concept, but as a continuously evolving system of possibility. Just as the presentation reached its climax, something unexpected happened. The communication systems of the research chamber flickered. A transmission came through, encrypted, but clearly originating from the human diplomatic channels they had previously contacted. Marcus Rodriguez's holographic image appeared, not as a diplomatic representative, but as something more complex. A smile played at the edges of his expression, part challenge, part invitation. "Interesting discoveries," he said simply. "Shall we discuss?" The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Zarak realized in that moment that their entire investigation might have been anticipated, guided, perhaps even orchestrated. Enx's quantum processors ran rapid probability scenarios. The likelihood of this being a coincidence was mathematically negligible. Talryn's computational systems detected multiple layers of communication hidden within the transmission. Not just words, but a complex network of potential interactions. Luma's empathetic sensors picked up something extraordinary. The transmission carried an emotional signature that was an invitation, not just to dialogue, but to a fundamentally new way of understanding. The research chamber erupted into a cacophony of reactions: excitement, fear, uncertainty, wonder. Zarak understood now why humans were both fascinating and terrifying to the galactic community. They were not just another species. They were a continuous process of reimagining possibility. The holographic displays continued to shift and breathe. The model of human potential was not a conclusion. It was an invitation. As Marcus Rodriguez's image faded, a simple message remained: ready to explore.